You're listening to the Sex and Psychology Podcast, the sex ed you never got in school and won't get anywhere else. I am your host, Dr. Justin Lehmiller. I am a social psychologist and research fellow at the Kinsey Institute and author of the book, Tell Me What You Want, The Science of Sexual Desire and How It Can Help You Improve Your Sex Life. Most of us would probably assume that if someone loves us, we won't just know it, we'll definitely feel it too. But that's not necessarily true. A lot of people have had the experience of being cared for on paper, meaning they have a partner, a family, and some good friends who provide a lot of affection, yet they still feel unseen, insecure, or emotionally empty. It turns out that being loved and feeling loved are not necessarily the same thing, and the gap between them has huge consequences for our mental health, our relationships, and even our sex lives. In this episode, we're going to explore why love so often doesn't land, the myths that block us from receiving it, and how modern life, including smartphones and other technology, is helping to make us feel more alone than ever. My guest is Sonia Lubomirsky, a distinguished professor of psychology at the University of California, Riverside, and author of the best-selling books, The How of Happiness and The Myths of Happiness. Her latest book, co-authored with Dr. Harry Reese, is titled How to Feel Loved, the 5 Mindsets That Will Get You More of What Matters Most. This is going to be a fascinating conversation that will help you to understand why feeling unloved can happen even in good relationships and what needs to change inside of us for love to really stick. Stick around because we're going to jump in right after this short break. Are you curious about sex and psychology in other countries? Join me and Sexual Health Alliance as we expand your knowledge through their study abroad programs. We'll explore different cultures, engage in immersive learning experiences, and collaborate with international experts while traveling to amazing places and having fun with students from all around the world. Since 2015, Sexual Health Alliance has remained at the forefront of sexuality education. Join me and Shaw and a global community of students for a transformative study abroad adventure. Our 2026 study abroad offerings include courses in Paris and Amsterdam. Check them out and learn more at sexualhealthalliance.com. Come meet fantastic people and be at the leading edge of sexual health education with Sexual Health Alliance. Spots for 2026 are available now. Visit sexualhealthalliance.com to secure yours today and embark on an exciting global adventure to study sex and psychology with me. Hi, Sonia, and welcome to the show.
Hi, Justin. Great to be here.
Well, it's wonderful to have you here as well. So let's talk about love. Now, a lot of people would probably assume that if someone loves them, they're going to know it and they're going to feel it. But your book opens with a really important distinction between being loved and feeling loved. You know, you can have a caring partner, supportive friends, and lots of other evidence in your life that people value, and yet you can still feel emotionally empty or uncertain about whether anybody else actually cares. So can you please explain for us what's going on here? You know, what accounts for that gap between the love that exists and the love that we actually experience?
Exactly. So we can be loved, but not feel loved. And in fact, my co-author, Harry Reese, and I did a survey, and I think we found that something like 70%, at least in some relationships in their lives, like don't feel as loved as they want to be. I actually think that number is an understatement. I actually think it's higher. One of the parallels I draw is like with loneliness. You know, you can be surrounded by people, right? But still be lonely, right? So you can be loved and not feel loved. And there's like so many interesting reasons why. One metaphor that I really like, I'm actually not sure where we found it, but this idea that there's like a cup of love. Like we all have this sort of this cup of love. And let's say you're my friend, Justin, and you show me love and you know, you love me and you kind of express love. And it's like, you're filling up my cup of love, but maybe I have a leak at the bottom of the cup, you know, and like the love kind of leaks out. Or maybe the opening at the top is not very large, so it sort of never gets in. And that's actually also like a way to describe people who are anxiously attached or avoidantly attached. I mean, I'm not an attachment expert, but that's sort of an interesting thing. And it's so interesting. Like, have you ever watched the show Couples Therapy?
Yes.
Yeah, I love that show. Like, so interesting, right? These are real couples in New York. They kind of forget the camera's there. And like they're talking and they're fighting. And it seems so obvious that like, no matter what the guy does, the woman doesn't feel loved, you know, no matter what the woman or man, you know, whoever, whatever they do. And their fighting is about like, you don't go to the gym or you don't, you know, it's whatever, but it's really about not feeling loved. And so I think it's very common that happens. And so, yeah, that's why we wrote a book about it.
I think a lot of people can relate to that, where they've been in a relationship with someone and they know on some level that the other person loves them, but they just don't feel it for some reason. There's some block to being able to experience that. And it can say something potentially about the relationship, but it can also be some deeper issue with the individual. And we'll kind of get into that more as we go along today. But I think another important distinction that you make in your work is to highlight the difference between feeling admired and feeling loved, right? So in our culture, we get a lot of feedback that looks and feels like admiration. For example, on social media, you might get a lot of likes or comments on a post, and people might compliment you or praise you for your achievements. However, despite the fact that we get this frequent praise, many people say they don't really feel seen or cared for. So I wondered if you could kind of explain the difference between admiration and love, and why admiration sometimes can make us feel even lonelier.
Yeah, it's such a good point. And the way I like to think about it is like when you're first meeting someone, say on a first date, or let's say it's a professional colleague, usually what we try to do is we try to impress the other person. And
Mhm.
that's very human, we all do this, very normal. Actually, I'd been on a lot of first dates and, we want the other person to think that we're kind and interesting and smart and funny. And we might succeed impressing them, but it doesn't forge a connection, right? We don't actually feel loved when the other person just thinks that, yeah, we are smart and interesting. It's not enough, right? Just to be admired, as you say. And that has to do really with being known, like truly
Mhm.
known. Because when we are admired, then the other person only really sees kind of that polished self, like that kind of positive. It's like we have this whole person and we're only showing the tip of our whole person, our whole self, just that positive part. And if that person only sees the positive part and they admire us, great, but they don't really know us. One way to say it is like, I'll never really feel loved if the other person doesn't really know me, because I'll wonder like if they really knew me, because of course we're all complex. We all have sort of other messy insides. Then maybe they wouldn't love me, right? So you can't like truly feel loved when you're not known. I should say there's one exception. There's probably more than one, but the biggest exception I think is with small children, right? A small child, you can really feel loved by a small child when
Mhm.
they don't really know you, right? At least when they're small. um, anyway, I think that's a fascinating thing to think about. So I think being known and truly knowing the other person is really key.
Yeah, and this has me thinking about how celebrities and social media influencers who have these really big followings often feel very deeply alone. And that occurs despite the fact that everybody knows who they are, right? And that they get a lot of respect and admiration and so forth. But it's exactly what you're saying, that none of these people really know them on a deeper level. It's all superficial. And so you can have all of the admiration in the world, but it can really not be very meaningful to the individual if it's not accompanied by, something that's deeper that really connects you to another person.
Exactly. Like, so they know who they are, they know their name, they know something about them, right? But they don't really know who they are, right, inside. And that really involves like deeper conversation. I often say, like, I'm done with small talk forever. I understand sometimes small talk can be a social lubricant, but I feel like life is too short. And it means you have to go into sort of medium or kind of deeper talk. And it's interesting, study, Nick Kepley at University of Chicago has done studies where he shows that people, they underestimate the extent to which people want to be asked deeper questions. Like we think that if I ask you something about your personal life and your sort of your inner life, that you might perceive me as sort of nosy or prying. I actually, just my daughter the other day said that to me. She's like, well, I can't ask. She had a roommate that was clearly having like a lot of problems. And I said, well, maybe, ask her what's going on. And she's like, oh no, mom, I can't ask her. Like that'd be prying. And sometimes that could be true, right? But on average, like, no, we want to be seen, we want to be heard, we want to be asked. So going deeper with another person, at the right pace, I think it's really important.
Yeah, totally agree. So there are a lot of people who carry around this belief that love is something that you earn, that once you're more successful, more attractive, more confident, more healed, that you'll somehow suddenly be quote unquote worthy of love. So in other words, before we can feel loved, some of us think that we have to deserve it or we have to earn it first. But what's the problem with thinking about love through this lens, that it's something that you have to deserve before you can actually feel it or receive it from someone else?
One caveat is like, yeah, it's always good, by the way, to try to be a better person and evolve and work on yourself. So I don't want to say that, we shouldn't put our best foot forward. But I think that's one of the sort of myths or misconceptions about love or feeling loved is that like, I'll get the love I deserve, right? I'll feel loved when I achieve those things. Often these are extrinsic things. When, it's sort of, if I'm more attractive, I have more money, fame, popularity, status, success, then people will love me. And then that also means that I need to sort of show off and broadcast those things to others, and hide the negative stuff, the weaknesses and the flaws. And again, like, we're really not talking about love. We're really talking about admiration here, right? So like, there's nothing wrong about having some of those things. And we do admire people who are successful and who might be rich and beautiful and famous. Yeah, but that doesn't make us feel loved. Again, it's really about being known for our sort of, quote, true self that works. That's not the extrinsic stuff that works.
Yeah, what you were saying there reminds me of this whole section you have in the book where you talk about these if only stories that people tell themselves. If only my partner spoke my love language, if only they knew the real me, if only I were more attractive or successful. And, these if only stories can feel very convincing to the individual that's saying them. But you say that they're myths that really just get in the way of love and prevent it from actually landing. So I'm curious, which of these if only myths do you see people kind of tripping up on the most? And how do you want people to rethink or reevaluate that belief?
Good question about which ones trip people up the most. It probably depends on the person, but certainly the idea, like, if I were more attractive, like, depending on gender, but there's gender difference, of course, if I were more beautiful, rich, successful, finally, I'll find that person, I'll find the love. The love languages is actually an interesting topic. Maybe we could save that for later. If only, the other person like spoke my love language, we found the match, because it turns out that matching love languages isn't really the key. And also this idea that, like, so people think that, to feel more loved, either you need to change yourself, like to become more lovable, which means to become somehow more successful and beautiful and famous and popular and higher status, or to change the other person, right? If I could get the other person to love me more. The first one really, again, nothing wrong with pursuing those things necessarily, unless it's like you're too obsessed with it. It's not going to get you to feel love. The second one, you really don't have that much control over the other person. And so we actually have a really empowering message in our book, which is that actually feeling loved is under your control, because it seems like it's not. Like, it's like, well, the other person has to love me more, so that, how do I do that? Because really, it's not about changing yourself. It's not really about changing the other person, but it's about changing the conversation. When you think about a relationship, really is a series of conversations. And especially if you define conversation kind of broadly, because even when you're touching, you're like in a conversation with each other. So it's really about changing the series of conversations that you're having. And that's much more under your control, what and how you present yourself and how you talk about, as opposed to just like getting the other person to love you. So yeah, it's actually more empowering than people think.
Are you tired of navigating the confusing and, let's be honest, sketchy world of libido supplements? You're not alone. There are tons of libido products on the market that make big promises, but finding one that actually lives up to the hype is a tall order, because many of the options out there contain questionable ingredients, or they're underdosed or ineffective. But what if there was a libido booster you could actually trust? Let me introduce you to Drive Boost from VB Health. VB Health has a simple mission: creating supplements that work. Their formula isn't a mystery. It's doctor-formulated, third-party tested for purity and potency, and proudly made here in the USA. And here's something else that makes Drive Boost unique. It's designed for men and women alike. So if you're ready to ditch the shady stuff and choose a libido supplement that's effective and that you can feel confident about, it's time to check out Drive Boost. Learn more and get yours at vb.health. Visit vb.health and use code Justin for 10% off, or click the link in the show notes. And that's good to know and good to hear, because, this is one of those topics where, a lot of people really, really struggle with this, and it can be very emotionally devastating when they don't feel loved. And so to that end, I wanted to ask, what are the consequences of not feeling loved? If you spend months or even years not feeling loved, even inside a relationship that might look okay from the outside, what tends to happen? How does that show up in terms of our physical and mental health?
Right. Well, getting back to like evolutionary psychology, really feeling loved is just very evolutionarily adaptive, right? We would not survive and reproduce if we didn't feel love or didn't feel loved. And so when we don't feel loved, same thing. And it's very, very similar to loneliness, because I think that a moment when you don't feel loved is also a moment when you feel lonely. I don't want to say they're the same thing, but I think they really go together. And so not feeling loved and also feeling lonely, it feels very aversive, right? It feels really awful. And partly because it's a signal to us that like something needs to change. And it's a very important signal. And so when you think about it that way, though, it makes it seem more like manageable and also like more adaptive. It's like, yeah, like, okay, so I have a moment that I don't feel love. Now it's when it's a long-term relationship and you never really feel love. That's a different story. That's much worse. It's much more chronic. I like to think of it as sort of like, here's a moment that I'm not feeling loved, like say by my adult child, or my colleague or my romantic partner. What do I do with that? But it does, it really has these costs. It really wears on you. And there's sort of lots of research that shows that like, if you don't consistently feel loved, there's going to be physical like health. People suffer in terms of their physical health. They suffer, of course, in terms of the mental health. It's not feeling loved associated with anxiety and depression. You get chronic illness. You could even relate not feeling loved to sort of other kind of negative things that happen in society, even things like violence. Why do people like do bad things to each other? Sometimes it's just like because they're lonely and they don't feel loved. I actually was talking about someone who is an expert in terrorism and like also gang activity. And I was like, you know what, if these, and often these are young men who don't have families and romantic partners. And I'm like, they need to feel more loved, I'm not an expert in this area, but I think that lack of feeling loved can be responsible for lots of sort of bad things in society, but certainly at the individual level, sort of physical health and mental health costs.
Yeah. And, I can also see some potential gender differences here from the standpoint that, we know that men and women are socialized differently and that women tend to have more emotionally intimate relationships in their lives than men do. For men, their only intimate emotional relationship is usually with their spouse or long-term partner. And so we know that we're living in a world where increasingly more people as adults are being single, and online dating and all these things, it's becoming harder to connect and find partners that we're going to be with and establish long-term relationships. And in some ways, it is more perilous for men in that they haven't cultivated other sources of social and emotional support. And so you can really think about a lot of really damaging negative implications for men's mental health, but also for society when you have all of these guys who want to have relationships, but are unable to find love and feel love and don't have any other sources that they've ever cultivated to experience that.
Right. Which is, it's so important. And again, getting back to, you mentioned sort of like intimate social connection that women are more likely to have, which involve really being known and knowing the other person, and involves having those deeper conversations. Like, how are you really feeling today? Right. And of course, like men's friendships, I'm not an expert on this, but I know there's some research showing that men's friendships tend to often revolve around sort of activities, right, doing together. And that's great too. But those sort of intimate conversations really sort of are the key again. I mean, I have like male friends who will have other male friends. They really know nothing about them. I had a male friend they do activities together all the time. And the other friend was getting a divorce and the guy didn't even know it. I'm like, how could you not know that he's getting divorced? But I hope that's changing. I'm part of a community of friends where the men really like share and talk and listen to each other. So it's very possible to change that.
Yeah, it is possible to change, but it is something still that a lot of people really, really struggle with. But that's one of the more reasons why your book and your work is important, because it helps provide people with these practical tools for helping them to experience and feel more love in their lives. Now, I think one of the most timely parts of your book is your discussion of how modern life has made us over digital and under social. Even small things, just like sitting your phone on the table next to you while you're having dinner with your partner or spouse, can reduce feelings of connection. So I wondered if you could talk to us a little bit about how, from a psychological standpoint, our relationship with modern technology is changing our ability to feel loved. What are we losing when our interactions increasingly move through screens, or when our face-to-face interactions are always in competition with our phones, which are in our pockets or sitting right next to us all the time?
Exactly. Well, I'm not the first person to say that sort of humans were kind of hardwired for in-person interactions, for like voice and seeing the other person's face and touch. and really breathing the same air, right? There's something like we're now on a video call, right? Like we're not actually breathing the same air. And it does take away a little bit from the intimacy of the conversation. You mentioned like having lots of likes, on social media that might feel good a little bit. Maybe there's some little dopamine hits from every like, but it still leaves you feeling a little lonely because these followers don't really know you. We've done some studies that show that voice is really critical. We did one study where we were looking at like how connected people felt when they were like face to face versus like a phone call with voice or a video call or like texting, social media. And actually anything involving voice was the most connecting, where you felt like a sense of mutual trust and warmth and feeling in sync, which is interesting. Again, hardwired to hear each other's voices, real voices. We're just not getting to know each other as deeply, although it's possible, right? You can text someone a vulnerable share. But again, we're sort of not hardwired for sort of face-to-face and voice. And then, of course, there's a whole question of like AI companions, which I really think, are already like hugely popular and commonly used. And I think we're actually underestimating at how much this is going to grow. And again, this is the AI companion, whether it's a chatbot or like a voice, involving voice, it feels real. Like for the same reason that like when we watch a movie, we might cry and laugh, right? Even though we know the movie's not real, we know the chatbot's not real. Like it doesn't really have feelings for us, but we're kind of fooled that it does, right? So there's so much to think about and say about that. That world is really changing. Our kids are gonna, like I remember reading somewhere, if you have a young child, like their first relationship will probably be with an AI companion, not with a real person. Boy, right? That's a lot to wrap your head around.
Yeah, I hadn't really thought about that angle before. And it's interesting. We don't really do that much to teach kids about relationships and how to cultivate happy, healthy relationships. And AI is going to come in and kind of do the job for us that we're not doing. And, I can see how that has the potential to be great and how it has the potential to be terrible, right?
There's actually a study I just want to mention. There's a study in China that found that these are married women who had chatbot companions that really benefited from, they learned how to have conflict conversations with their husbands where they have a lot less power. And so there was an example of like that actually they were able to improve their sense of agency and power in the relationship, may improve the relationship from practice with the AI companion. So I can imagine, there's some benefits, but, of course there could be like huge costs as well.
I think the other risk too with the AI technology is that it doesn't really know us on that deep level that, another human being can. It can't reject you, right? It takes all of the risk out of a social interaction away, because there's always the potential when you're interacting with another human being that they might decide that they don't like you anymore or that they don't want to be with you and so forth. And so that makes the stakes higher and it's different. And so, if you're only interacting with this bot that like literally can't reject you, I do see a risk in that for some people, it might make them never want to leave the safety of that bubble. And it might make dealing with actual real world rejection that much harder because we've never had the practice or experience with it when we were younger.
Exactly. In fact, even before AI came into the picture, there's this great article, you probably have read it in the Atlantic, called The Sex Recession, right? It's about sort of how young people's lives have changed. And there are these incredible interviews with these young people who say things like, it's just too much effort to actually go on a date and like this is about sex, like go like beyond like first, second base. People my age were like, what do you mean it's too much effort? And it's kind of similar. It's like, I'd rather just talk to an AI companion than actually put the effort into talking to a real person and risk being rejected and all of that, where you say. So there are things you can learn. I talk a lot about listening in the book and the importance of really good, what's called high quality listening. And you could argue, so chatbots are absolutely the best listeners in the world, right? They'll remember everything, right? They'll remember everything and they'll tell you that what they remember. And so a human being can never beat that. And so that's very compelling, right? So lots of, and they can show, at least they can fake curiosity. Curiosity is really important too. And they can be very compelling.
Yeah. And it's something where we'll just have to wait and see what the research and data say down the line, because we don't ultimately know what the effects are going to be for better or for worse. Now, since you brought up sex, and this is the Sex and Psychology podcast, I did have a sex question for you that I wanted to ask. When someone doesn't feel loved, that often changes their sexual desire. Sometimes their desire will shut down completely, but other times people will seek sex or chase sex, hoping that it's going to create the closeness or feeling of intimacy that they so desperately want. So from your perspective, How is sexual desire connected to feeling loved? And why do some people need to feel loved before they want sex and other people kind of use sex to try and feel loved?
Sex is like a conversation, right? So there's just so much happening, dynamic, so many signals going back and forth. But yeah, I'm going to think about it in terms of just like the conversation that we can have, we can shift how we approach that conversation. And if we approach the conversation like kind of the have that you have during sexual activity, the same way that we're just talking, is the same kind of advice that we give in the book, which is sort of really listening to the other person, right? Attuning, showing curiosity in them, and sharing, like sort of sharing what your desires, what you want. And so that's not really answering the question. That's really more saying sort of how actually like sex could be part of how you can feel more loved, or make the other person feel more loved. But in terms of the question about like why sort of, I'm not sure if I can answer that, why people differ, because both of those things are true, right? You can feel loved through intimacy and sex, but also if you already feel more loved, you're going to have more desires. So I think it really goes in both directions. A lot of people say like you can't really love another before you love yourself. And actually Esther Perel like at one point said something like, no, that's wrong. It's like both are true. Sometimes you learn to love in the context of relationship, and you learn to love yourself in the context of relationship. So there's a sort of this bi-directional thing going, and same thing between sort of sex and feeling loved. Sexual desire, as you know, is like so complicated and so can be so like fragile and dynamic. By the way, I love the book Come As You Are about women's sexuality. I think that really helped me to understand a lot about like how women's sexual desire can really change in all the contexts, and how you can actually create your own context and actually give it out as gifts to people.
Yeah. And, speaking of Emily Nagoski's work, if you're somebody who experiences more responsive desire, or that's the only type of desire that you really experience, if you don't feel loved, that could be a case where it's going to be really challenging to feel sexual desire, because you're not getting any of the seeds or ingredients that you need in order for desire to even set in. By contrast, if you're somebody who experiences more spontaneous sexual desire, whether you feel loved or not might not have as much of a bearing on the amount of sex that you actually want to have, right? So I think differences in desire could be part of it. It could also be differences in attachment style. If you're somebody who's really anxiously attached, that's one of those things where I can see it going in either direction, where you're seeking out more sex for like reassurance that your partner actually does love you. Or if you're not feeling loved, it could lead to withdrawal or disengagement because, again, you're not kind of getting those needs met that you have.
Exactly right. And then I just wanted to add, there's also individual differences, of course, the extent to which they need kind of an emotional connection to have sexual desire. Like, is it demisexual, right? The kind of person who really needs the emotional connection to have great sex. And so people differ in that, and other people just don't need that as much. It could be something else for them.
Yeah, and related to that more broadly is the concept of sociosexuality, which is kind of like the degree to which you see sex and emotion is going together. And, for people who have what we call a restricted sociosexual orientation, these are folks who need to have that love in order to have sex, and they need to have that emotional connection. But for people who are at the unrestricted end of the continuum, sex and emotion are these completely separate things, and they can do one without the other. So again, it's going to vary based on individuals, based on relationships. But I do think it's this fascinating topic about how feeling loved and sexual desire can be connected in these different ways for different people.
So fascinating. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for this amazing conversation, Sonia. In the next episode, we're going to get really practical and dive into the 5 mindsets that actually teach people how to receive and create more love in their lives. Can you please tell my listeners where they can go to learn more about you and your work and get a copy of your new book?
My book is called How to Feel Loved with Harry Reese, and it's just howtofeelloved.com. So howtofeelloved.com is the website. Everything's there. By the way, we have a quiz where people can take a quiz where they find out what are their strongest mindset, what's their weakest mindset. That's on that website. So howtofeelloved.com. Thank you.
Great. And I'll be sure to include links to that in the show notes. So thank you again so much for your time. I really appreciate having you here. Thank you for listening. To keep up with new episodes of this podcast, visit my website, Sex and Psychology, at sexandpsychology.com, or subscribe on your favorite platform, where I hope you'll take a moment to rate and review the show. If you listen on Apple Podcasts, please consider becoming a Sex and Psychology Premium subscriber to enjoy ad-free listening for just $3.99 a month. You can also follow me on social media for daily sex research updates. I'm on Blue Sky and X at Justin Lehmiller, and Instagram at Justin J. Lehmiller. Also, be sure to check out my book, Tell Me What You Want. Thanks again for listening. Until next time.